Greetings, comrades, and welcome to The Southwest is Red, the podcast in which we discuss the latest news about the Global South from a Latin American perspective, with a Chinese twist. I'm one of your hosts, Pedro.
And I'm your other host, Nico. This has been an interesting week, I have to say. Lately, the US media has been surprising me because of the way they are talking about China. I don't know if you remember, but during Biden's administration, they always were saying the same things. China was weak, their technology was bad, they were being replaced by India or by Vietnam. And now that Trump ramped up this trade war, suddenly they realized that China was not about to fall. In fact, now the media is even saying that it can win the trade war. Talk about a reality shock.
Yeah, not only that, but there are some rumors lately about Trump reducing the tariffs because, as his Treasury Secretary said, they are not sustainable. And there are also rumors that Elon Musk is leaving the government. It seems that the plan of the capitalists ruling directly is also a failure.
Yes, we're seeing some sharp limits for the original plan of Trump. It seems that on one hand, China is not so weak, and on the other hand, the US was not so strong. But I have to say that at the same time, anything can happen with Trump. So we will have to see how the situation develops.
I also think we should definitely mention the death of Pope Francis, right? I don't know about you, my friend, but I was a little bit surprised by the reaction to his death. Not amongst the Catholics, of course, but I saw many people of leftists, communists, talking about the communist Pope. And, well, it was not the usual far right, everything is communism style.
No, it surprised me too, because of course we all know that Francisco was probably one of the most outspoken world leaders against neoliberalism. And also, he was a strong defender of the Palestinian cause. You probably remember he had this daily call with the Christians in Gaza. So, in a world in which within the left we don't have so many people we can look up to, we could at least look up to the Pope a bit. But for me, also, I've seen some people go too far in their defense of the Pope. For example, some were talking about his positions on LGBTQ people as, oh, he was so progressive. And I guess it was good compared to what the church said before, but it was far from a progressive position. And I think that although Francisco's ideology intersected in some ways with current leftism, he was in fact following a very different ideological system, and that's important to remember.
Yeah, and we even didn't discuss Francisco's main defect. He was Argentinian, come on. So
I will let that one pass, especially because today we have such a thriller episode based on the saga that's even more popular nowadays than Severance. Argentina and its debt crisis.
oh well, talk about a thriller. As all Argentinians, I think you think too highly of yourself. People just know about Messi, and that's all. But I have to admit that Argentina has been in the news lately. It's not common to see a country achieve this crazy goal of getting $60 billion of loan from the IMF. I mean, 45% of the total loans of the IMF go to Argentina. This is nuts.
It's a rare achievement, especially because no one, not even the IMF, thinks we are going to pay for it. Besides my national pride, though, I think this situation gives us a good opportunity to discuss how the international monetary system works and why is Argentina in this situation, and also some recent comments by the US Treasury Secretary Besant in his visit to Argentina. In his visit, he said that Argentina should look to pay up the loan it has with China, that is in fact a currency swap between Argentina and China, because China has, and I will quote here what he said, signed a number of these rapacious deals Marx has said, where they've taken mineral rights, they've added huge amounts of debt onto these countries' balance sheets. They are guaranteeing that future generations are going to be poor and without resources. And we don't want that to happen anymore that already has in Latin America.
Well, rapacious deals. Well, now they know how to use like proper English, right? For me, there are two main issues with his speech. First one, it's a little bit ironic because he was criticizing Argentina's swap with China, which is 5 billion USD. And at the same time, Argentina just signed an IMF loan for $60 billion. So how can you accuse China of impoverishing Argentina when you're forcing them to accept 60 billion? And it's also a good opportunity to talk about this debt trap diplomacy thing. Although this has been debunked by US scholars, even the US liberal media, it is still a talking point for the US government. And it kind of connects to our last episode. It's interesting to rethink these accusations. They are a projection, right? Every accusation is a confession, as everyone says.
We really have another action-packed episode, huh? I don't know how we're going to cover all these topics in 40 minutes, but we will definitely try. And fail, like Argentina, while pairing their debts.
Well, you shouldn't be throwing rocks to the sky, because remember that our financial situation is not so good either. So
True, true. Let's not talk about that right now. I'm depressed enough just by thinking about Argentina. Maybe I was thinking you could start with the history and the role of the International Monetary Fund for those of our listeners who are not Argentinian and maybe they are not so familiar with this institution.
and maybe we should have named this episode as Don't Cry for Me, Argentina, right? Let's take a trip to the past. Because if we want to understand what the IMF is, we need to start with a particular moment in recent history, the aftermath of World War II, and more specifically, the Bretton Woods Conference. For those of you who are not familiar with this name, the Bretton Woods Conference was a meeting that took place in the United States around 1944, and different from the other war conferences where the leaders, well, they are mainly talking about the war effort, planning battles, etc. Bretton Woods was to talk about money. And we know that money is an important thing too, right?
It is the most important thing. And what's a little bit ironic here is that the war wasn't ended and they were already deciding the economic order that would follow it. Talk about confidence.
Yeah, well, they were very confident at the time. Let's make a resume of 1944, okay? In terms of the war. The Normandy offensive was underway. Soviet forces were driving Germany away from Belarus. The US was scoring some great victories against the Japanese in the Pacific. And the Chinese, well, they're fighting hard those battles in Hunan. So the end of the war was just a matter of time. And with that in mind, the Allies, and when I say the Allies, I mean the US, they started to think about these future problems, financial and monetary world order.
It may be a little bit cliched to mention, but it is always necessary due to the crazy amounts of propaganda that have gone around since the end of World War II, that the US participation in the war was not motivated by their desire to save people from concentration camps. There was also a geopolitical interest related to the great power competition that we described briefly in the first episode.
Exactly. At the time, and in my opinion, today too, realism is alive and kicking. And it was totally necessary to think about the things would work after the war. Because if we analyze before the conflict started for real, the international economic scenario wasn't quite peaceful. The Great Depression, First World War, they were important factors to finish the previous monetary system, the gold standard that Britain loved so much. So we could say that the idea of creating a reconstruction and development bank that today is a part of the World Bank that we all know, and an organization that would be responsible for, and here I have to quote the IMF website, okay? Fostering global cooperation and reducing poverty around the world. It sounded great.
It sounded great, and I think it's also important to put this development in the context of the processes of the colonization in Africa and South Asia. In theory, at least, it was expected that institutions like the World Bank or the IMF would be key players in helping these newly formed countries. But let me guess, this was only good in theory, right?
Unfortunately, you are right. A lot of things, they start like a good idea, and imagine that we could say that about the IMF. And later they turn out to be a terrible practice. We Latinos, we are quite used to that. And what happened over the course of the years following Bretton Woods was the gradual development of a complex network of loans and other economic practices that, well, they threw us and the other developing countries in a social political chaos. For us, especially towards the end of the 80s, the end of the last century, we could say. And this monetary financial order led by the US was a key part of the grand strategy in international relations, this revival of their hegemony, something that we discussed a lot in the previous episodes too.
I have to say that before you explain all this, I thought that the IMF was evil, but now I'm completely sure. Let's keep going and discuss a little bit how Argentina got to be under the control of the IMF and how that impacted our political sovereignty. I believe that although Argentina is kind of an extreme case, well, we hold 45% of the debt, no? So it's pretty extreme. It is very representative of the limits that semi-colonial countries face in the current financial system. And I would love to tell the complete story of the relationship between Argentina and the IMF, but it would take us days, maybe months. So I will try to limit myself to the latest iteration, because it is easy to mark a separation between the previous programs with the IMF and the current ones. Since in 2006, the Argentinian government paid all the outstanding debt, and in 2018, the government entered a new program. So we can make a clear cut and start with 2019. However, to understand why the Argentinian government of the time asked money from the IMF, first we need to understand a little bit the constraints of the Argentinian economy since 2002.
No, wait. So basically, you're saying that you cannot talk about the whole history, so you're only going to speak about 25 years. Is that right? Well, because if that's so, I feel so relieved. Like, you have no idea.
When you put it like that, I have to agree. Maybe 25 years is too little. In fact, now I feel forced to add that in the 90s and up to 2002, Argentina had a monetary system in place in which 1 peso was equivalent to $1. But after the 2001 economic crisis, which was one of the worst crises in Argentina's history, the government devalued the peso. This started a process of economic growth that was also related to the commodity boom of the early 2000s, but also of inflation and the reappearance of the so-called external restriction. I think probably most of our listeners are familiar with inflation, although probably not as familiar as we Argentinians are.
Yeah, like don't even mention inflation. I maybe not that old, but I do remember what one Brazilian real was capable of buying back in the 90s. And my parents, they don't even like to talk about how crazy it was living during the 80s, like in Brazil. So inflation was a nightmare for us all.
Just so you can imagine this very clearly, I can offer an example of the Argentinian situation in terms you are very familiar with: cigarettes. In 2002, my father used to buy a 20 cigarette box for 2 Argentinian pesos. But nowadays, in 2025, the same 20 cigarettes go for more than 4,000 Argentinian pesos. That is why when I see people from the US or Europeans that they are complaining about their paltry inflation they had these last years, I can only laugh or cry, mostly cry.
Some people use the gold standard, I use the cigarette standard, so I can't argue against that. But I don't know, I'm starting to feel this episode is just a cry for help. You definitely should go to therapy, my friend.
Actually, I have a therapist, but she's also from Argentina. But let me get back on track. As I was saying, probably most of our listeners are familiar with the concept of inflation, although they didn't experience it at the levels that we are used to in Argentina. But probably what most of our listeners don't know about is what external restriction means. Because I believe that it's an economic concept that is used almost always in relation to Argentina. So it's a little bit of an original concept, and it is intimately related to the economic order after Bretton Woods and the hegemony of the US dollar in global finance. In simple words, because we don't want to get this any more economically technical
Please.
that we need, it's already too much. The issue that Argentina faces cyclically is that it doesn't produce enough dollars endogenously. So it has to ask benevolent entities like the IMF for those missing dollars.
Yeah, and I'm sure these benevolent people are more than happy to lend these dollars, right? But okay, wait a second. I was listening to the current leader of the IMF, Kristalina Georgieva, and I must say that I loved her name, by the way, just the name. And she said that Argentinians they have $200 billion under their mattresses. Well, I'm not so good at math. That's why I study history, But last time I checked, 200 billion is more than 60 billion. And that is the amount of the IMF loan. And but don't even mention the tiny sum of $5 billion of the Chinese loan. Because with that amount, according to my math, you cannot even fill 2 mattresses, right?
Without noticing, I think she made a really good point because, of course, it is not Argentinians that have so much money under their mattresses, at least not common Argentinians. You can check my mattress, only cat hairballs under there. And yeah, I know I need to clean. This crazy amount comes from adding all the dollars that are produced in Argentina without counting the imports and the debt service payments. So if you do that, you will notice that Argentina does in fact produce a lot of things. So it should have, in theory at least, enough foreign currency to support their economy. But here is the neat trick. This metric only includes investments in stocks or in physical capital, but it doesn't take into account the earnings of the capitalist. Actually, the sectors that produce goods for export and get foreign currency, like agricultural landlords or the mining and oil industry, are either in the hands of foreign companies that want to get their money back to their home countries. That's in most cases it's the US, or of the native capitalists that also want to get their money out. And here we get into the main contradiction of semi-colonial countries like Argentina. We are trapped in a cycle in which the common people have to work like crazy just to service a debt that is being used to secure the earnings of foreign capital or of the comprador native bourgeoisie. If only there was a tried and true method to solve this type of imbalances.
Well, I think there is a method to solve these imbalances, especially if you want to deal with landlords. But I don't know. I don't think the terms of use will allow us to discuss that. So I will leave that for our listeners, okay? Do your own research, use your imagination how to deal with landlords. But okay, let me add something. I was reading the IMF report on Argentina. Well, you sent me that, and 100 pages of torture, and some things stood out for me. The first, the IMF knows they don't think Argentina can pay this loan, and it makes sense because besides these structural issues in Argentina's economy, and that you described it, the fact that this loan is so huge and the current uncertainty in international situation, I don't know, it seems like a long shot. And of course, the IMF is not benevolent. We're just joking. They have a plan to make sure the money will be returned. It's the good old Washington consensus that we all know. So labor reforms, which means less right for workers, pension reforms, or the increasement of the retirement age, and of course, more state deregulation. So what can I say? As we all know, this kind of program has always turned out great for every country that has tried it, right? And yes, of course, I'm saying this with a total straight face, okay? No ironies at all. And no, the second thing that I noted is that the report actually, they mentioned the currency swap with China. They are affirming that China will refinance the loan. Can you see the irony? The U.S. Secretary of Treasury, he visited Argentina to congratulate the government on securing the loan, the IMF loan. The IMF loan cannot be paid and makes several requests for structural changes that will leave the common people poorer, more overworked, and without any prospect of retirement. But for them, the real problem is China. The small 5 billion loan that they have refinanced many times and probably they will continue to refinance, and that has no strings attached, and that Argentina could also pay. So you see, this is crazy.
At some point, it seems like the standard response of the US to anything bad that is happening is China. For the US, China is the devil, the source of all evil. I was reading an article the other day that expressed this way better than I can. They say, and I'm quoting, the only constant in American politics is that China is somewhere between a rival and the enemy. And to contain China, we must export our domestic hysteria to states who gain more from their relationship with China than lose. Now, I always feel the need to clarify that denying these examples of US propaganda does not mean that we should turn China into the opposite of the devil, a god or something like that. Just we shouldn't be part of this hysteria that the US is trying to sell us. China is also acting to defend their interests, as they should, no? But the conditions they offer for their loans and for their investments are not some kind of secret plot to conquer Latin America or Africa or Asia. And at least China is not saying, like Kristalina Georgieva, which candidate should the Argentinians vote for?
Right. It's not about worshipping China. China is a country, they have their own interests. And this is something that we are going to discuss on the next session. Because besides this interests question, we are also going to talk about the debt trap diplomacy myth, how it was created, debunked, and now it has an afterlife as a gringo projection. We are back, but for now, let's forget about Argentina mistakes, at least for a while. No one wants a 30-hour-long episode, right?
I do want one, but I'm told by the powers that be that it's not advisable in marketing terms.
Totally not advisable, my friend. You know, the funny thing about this debt trap diplomacy myth is that the story is so well known that even people with a certain degree of knowledge are tempted to repeat it. Not so long ago, gossip time, okay? I posted a video on my Instagram. I was talking about Brazil, China, and BRI, and a friend of mine, not gonna expose anyone, of course, who is a PhD student, came to my inbox and me a message to inform me about a secret clause in Chinese contracts with African nations. According to his sources, this clause allows China to take the land of nations who aren't capable of paying the loan, taking land or taking companies. I don't know, this debunking work sometimes is quite tiring.
First of all, name names. Don't leave us hanging. We want to know who this guy is. And regarding this debunking thing, on a personal level, I'm a little bit tired of it. Because as someone who has been interested in China for many, many years at this point, I have seen it all. And usually the person who is spreading these lies is not really interested in the truth. However, this case of the debt trap diplomacy is interesting because it is not us that we have to do the debunking. It has already been done by Western scholars and even Western media. So essentially, it only survives as a lie in social media or in the speeches of US officials like the Treasury Secretary we quoted at the start of the episode.
No, I'm not going to name anyone today. But you're right. It has been debunked already, even by the media. We say that. But this thing that the government, especially now, they keep repeating it, and it makes other people continue the story, but I feel it's tiring. And some parts of the media, they still, like, they are quite fond of this old tactic. It's difficult to not fall for this kind of propaganda when all these, like, the mainstream sources, the governmental ones too, they keep repeating them over and over. In the end, I don't blame my friend, even though I laughed at his face at the time, and I asked for the mysterious contract for me to check. But let's get serious. How did this whole thing start in the first place? We just spoke in the first part about how aggressive and greedy the IMF ambitions were since its inception. So, how can everyone, and of course, when I say everyone, I'm including us Latin Americans, we keep repeating this lie about China and forget about the real debt trap that jailed us for years, for decades? I think we should go back in time again to answer this question.
Usually, people want to travel back in time to kill Hitler or maybe create some kind of grandfather paradox. But I guess it says something about our vocation for history that you want to travel back to answer some kind of technical, obscure question. Regarding why the debt trap narrative subsists, I think we can differentiate between two reasons. The first reason is about the nature of propaganda and media consumption. It is easier to spread the lie than spread the later correction. And this could be thought about as a typical or as a good example of confirmation bias, in which when someone forms an opinion, then they tend to discard opposing viewpoints. In this sense, the secret clause argument is pretty good because it's unverifiable. It's impossible to know if it's true or not. And so the person who has this belief can always keep believing it. No, it's like if you believe that rocks speak to you, but they are very timid, so they only speak to you when you're alone. I also think that, and this would be like the second reason, the narrative of debt trap diplomacy has an impact because it touches on some real anxieties in global south countries. So, for example, if we take Argentina again as an example, we are used to loans from the IMF being used as a way to impose policy on our country. So it's reasonable to think, from a PTSD trauma response kind of thing, that China would do the same stuff. Even if we know by the evidence that this is not true, we would expect them to do so. That said, I also find it kind of incredible how these lies keep being repeated, even if we have articles from, I don't know, the Atlantic, a source that nobody would confuse with a leftist pro China magazine, saying it is essentially false.
Yeah, like totally. Well, I just need to mention that I love this histories of time travel, alternate history. Okay, but and I agree with you. Spreading lies is easy. Proving them wrong is the real issue. And it's funny that you mentioned the Atlantic because in 2019 they published an article which they were still repeating some now debunked lies. Even though the conclusion was that Chinese debt trap was not exactly like what everyone was affirming. And well, I don't know. We should definitely do some episode about discourse analysis one day. Okay. But okay, going back to our time travel. This narrative regarding China and unpayable loans started to take place around 2013. And coincidentally or not, it was around the time the Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI, was launched. But I think I should go a couple years back in time, a couple more years back in time, because why not explain one of the most famous cases of that trap, the Hambantota port in Sri Lanka, this country's second largest port. The construction started in 2008, before BRI, and even before the project started, the misinformation was already there, before the first bricks were laid. According to many Western sources, the Chinese government pushed Sri Lanka to build the port. But in reality, it was quite the contrary. The first feasibility studies, they were made in early 2000s by Canadian and Danish companies because the Sri Lankan government, they wanted to push this developmental agenda, and they asked India and the US for the financial help to build the project, which they denied. China was the third option.
Oh, that's a complex situation, no? And I think it's an important takeaway about this story is we need to understand how complex these processes can be. And that is possibly another reason why these type of narratives can take hold and are so difficult to debunk. Because we hear a story that has a couple of decades in which Canada, Denmark, India, the US are involved. And this also tells us that Sri Lanka is not being colonized by an evil China, but was instead considering several options among different countries, among different companies. So they had some agency in the process.
Yeah, it's not like Sri Lanka just had China's email address or Weixin contact or something. They wanted to start that project for a lot of reasons that we are going to discuss later. And for them, it didn't matter much who was going to pay for it. And another interesting fact, according to the IMF, around 2016, 3/4 of Sri Lankan debt was from private foreign institutions, or not China. Amongst the bilateral ones, China ranked in third place, behind India and Japan. Of course, I need to state that this calculation, it excludes the SOEs, state-owned enterprises participation, which is something that I am going to explain soon. Because, well, this SOE participation, it's kind of connected to another well-spread lie. But let me continue. One of the main fears of this debt trap thing is what happens when you don't pay your debts. In some sense, I feel that the people think the dynamics, the consequences of not paying these state level loans are the same as those of individual private level ones. We all know people who had problems with banks before. Well, if you listeners don't know, let me present ourselves again. I'm Pedro. I'm here talking with Nico. So, well, jokes aside, international loans, they work in a different way. In the Argentinian case is a great example of how these particularities are. In the Sri Lankan case, there was not a direct involvement of the Chinese government. It is true that the Chinese SOEs, they were the main negotiators. They lobbied hard within the government to push the negotiations forward. But let's remember what the word SOE stands for. You know, it's an acronym for State-Owned Enterprise. A lot of BRI projects, they were canceled by the same companies once they were deemed not viable or too risky. So what I'm trying to say is that an enterprise, as you all know already, is always looking for profit. In the sense, the Chinese ones, they're not different from the Western ones. They are looking for profit too. They saw an opportunity to make this happen in Hambatuta, and they took it.
I remember watching a conference a couple of years ago in which there was some debate regarding the Belt and Road Initiative. And one of the things that one of the speakers said is that many times the initiative is presented as state controlled. But in fact, there are several companies participating. No? Some are SOEs, some are private initiatives. And the control of the central government is not as big as sometimes we are led to believe. In fact, this applies to China as a whole, because there's a lot of push for a narrative of the omnipresent state that controls everything that happens in the country. But as we know, both from our personal experience and also from our research, China is in fact a relatively decentralized country, since enterprises, municipalities, provinces, they all have lots of autonomy for their economic decisions. And in many cases, the role of the central government is to provide general guidance. So, yeah, when we talk about the BRI or about debt trap diplomacy, we have to be conscious of the difference between state owned enterprises, private companies, and the Chinese state, which have different levels of interventions in the process. And there is a lot of variability from case to case. And also, let's remember something we mentioned in this episode already. IMF loans and a lot of other state level loans offered by Western countries or Western sponsor institutions always have certain conditions. The main difference from an individual loan is that the problems with the IMF start at the moment the money flows into your account, not only after you need to repay it. And it's really funny to have to mention that companies will not invest in places where they think it's not worth it, especially when their government isn't forcing the recipient country to accept all kinds of insane reforms and conditions to secure those payments.
Yeah, well, sometimes I feel a part of what we are doing here, like it's to restate the obvious, right? And now comes the fantastic thing. We already mentioned that Sri Lanka asked for the loan, which, as you just mentioned, didn't have these crazy conditions of the IMF Argentina one. And this was not a part of a grand Chinese strategy or something. Well, since the SOEs, they have this crazy high level of autonomy to deal with the foreign investment. I guess the third big lie of the day is that China took over the port to repay the debt. This is totally false, because the debt is still there and the port belongs to Sri Lanka. After the things started to go bad to Sri Lankan economy, and I must say that the topic of corruption and infrastructure projects in Sri Lanka is too much to cover today. But if you're a Latino, you may have a good idea of what I'm talking about. But okay. Around 2014, the government development strategy turned out to be a disaster and the country spiraled into a financial crisis afterwards. And in 2016, the IMF stepped in. And let me stress it again. According to their own Sri Lankan sources, most of the debt wasn't related with the port construction or repayment of Chinese loans. It is true that now Hambantota Port is operated by a Chinese company, but it's a lease contract. There wasn't a change in its ownership or anything, as it had been reported. And two last things I think it's important to mention too. Again, China was the third option because Sri Lanka, they were desperate to lease the port to pay off the debt. The central role of the Western debt also is something that I need to stress. Since the money they get from this agreement is to repay Western creditors. Because as you, Nico, and the IMF mentioned, China keeps refinancing the debt. They are not pushing Sri Lanka into chaos just to get their money back. Sometimes I feel they like they not want the money for now. At least that's what it seems to me.
It seems that when we analyze this case, we see something very different from the views of the Treasury Secretary of the US, about the Chinese government using debt as a way to win mineral rights or ownership of key infrastructure. Because, as you said, that's not what happened in Sri Lanka. And I'm a little bit tired of being the disclaimer guy, but what we're denying here is the existence of this plan that can be called Chinese debt trap diplomacy. A plan in which China uses debt as a way to own resources or infrastructure. Now, there can be particular cases in which the conditions of a private deal between a Chinese company and a company in another country are not so good, or that the agreement between the Chinese state and another state is not so beneficial for the country that receives the investment. And that is, of course, something that can be criticized in a case by case basis. And this is something that we also found in our reading. There is great variability between countries. There have been many studies, for example, in Africa, in particular, that show that the leaders of the African countries are very conscious of their own capacity for negotiation with China, and that investments in African countries sometimes they have very good results, sometimes they didn't have so good results. We have to understand this in all its variability, and we left some links below our post so you can check some studies about this topic. But this also leads me to another point. As Argentinians and Brazilians, we are the first to recognize that our countries have agency in this process of debt. It's not that the IMF came to Argentina and put a gun on our president's head to force him to accept a debt. In fact, they didn't even have to force him to accept the reforms. He was happy with them and even asked for more neoliberalism. He was really enjoying that part. So the original problem is not the debt agreement in itself. When we study these kind of issues, we need to know that the reason and the real issue is why these countries of the global south have to accept foreign debt and foreign investment. And that cannot be China's fault, for sure, because the main cause is the history of colonialism and semi-colonialism that left countries in this situation.
Exactly. And I feel we need to stress this again. It's not about worshipping China or saying that the government, they have no flaws or whatever. The thing is, no one asks for money because they want it or just because it's some kind of hobby or pastime or whatever, right? We need to have in mind that we and the other countries who had to resort to these alternatives, we were constrained, we were forced to do so. I don't know, I'm having a lot of ideas today, but I think we should definitely talk about semi-colonialism in the future. But not today, because I think our time is up. But before I go, I will cosplay my friend here, and I will finish with a quote from my beloved Conceição Tavares that I think it fits well for today's episode. An economy that does not care about social justice is an economy that condemns people to what is happening all over the world. A brutal concentration of income and wealth, unemployment, and misery.
And with that wise words, I think we can finish with this topic for now. We will back in a couple of weeks with more analysis and theorizing about what is going on in the world. And please don't forget to like, comment and subscribe. We cannot do this without your support. 再见。
再见。